Hello and welcome to Current Affairs on JTV. Joining me today are Colonel Richard Kemp, former commander of British forces in Afghanistan, and Tal Ofer, who's a Labour Party member and a member of the Board of Deputies Executive Committee. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me today. Our topic is the recent UN Security Council Resolution 2334. Richard, what is your view of UN SCR 2334? Is it as bad as people are making out?
I think it's a very, very bad resolution because it first of all makes the allegation that the Israeli or Jewish settlements in Judea and Samaria and the West Bank, including in Israel, which of course they're not, and what it does by accusing Israel of these illegal actions is to actually reduce the chances of peace negotiations, because there's no incentive really to the Palestinians, even if they wanted to negotiate peace, because they're simply being given what they're asking for without negotiations with the Israelis. And then in addition to that, it incites violence because it shows Palestinians that by their leadership in particular, that by their violent actions they can achieve so much. It will also encourage the BDS movements around the world, and it will encourage anti-Semitism in the world. So I think it's a terrible resolution. I think Britain made a very, very serious mistake in agreeing to it, and I think President Obama made a very serious mistake in not vetoing it.
Okay, lots in there to unpack, but Tal, do you agree with that point of view? Is that your reading as well?
No, I think I will have to disagree with Richard. I mean, I think while the resolution is clearly really bad for the settlements, it's actually really good for Israel because it requires Israel to make a decision into what direction it wishes to go, whether it's the one-state solution or the two-state solution. I do understand Richard's point of view and where he comes from in relation to the Palestinian incitement and violence, but actually, if you look at John Kerry's speech, he's actually called out the Palestinians about inciting violence and naming those buildings and cities which are named after terrorists. So overall, while Israel may not look at this resolution as really helpful, because as we know, the Israeli position is that direct negotiations with the Palestinians will lead to peace agreement, I think it's good that for Israel to consider what is friends and allies, and I think that the US, France and the UK are close allies of Israel, both in Europe and across the Atlantic, and it is a sign for Mr. Netanyahu that maybe he needs to change his policy in regards to the settlement, because what he did since 2009, since he made his famous Maryland speech where he spoke about the two-state solution and he said that there won't be any more land appropriation, he actually did the opposite. And with this new settlements regulation bill, which passed in the Knesset just the week before the UN resolution, it was basically the last straw for the international community.
Okay, Richard, you mentioned you didn't feel settlements were illegal. That's your reading of the situation. Tal has just said this is I suppose, a justly deserved resolution on the basis that the settlements are a bad thing. The crux of this is settlements, correct, in your view?
Well, that was really what the main thrust of the resolution was about, but that's not really the end of it. I mean, the reality is that the settlements are not illegal. There's no possible reason to say they're illegal apart from political reasons. There's no legal justification for it. Obviously there are differences in view on that, but although the British Foreign Office and the British Prime Minister have said that they're illegal, they know they're not, and they don't really believe they are. They think by saying that they're illegal, they will simply be applying pressure to Israel, which of course is the whole resolution, to apply pressure to Israel.
But pressure to what? But hang on, Richard. Pressure to what end? Pressure to what end?
Does not want. That the Palestinians do not wish to negotiate with Israel because they do not want to do the one thing that Israel really will require them to do, which is to accept the existence of the Jewish state.
Okay, but let's go back to that point you made about pressure. Pressure to what end? What is the British government, you feel, trying to pressure Israel into doing?
Well, I think ultimately the British government and the American government at present, but this won't continue when President Trump takes office, are trying to pressure Israel effectively into completely pulling out of the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and to their sovereignty over regions, which of course includes the most holy sites in the religion of Judaism. And I've got here a coin. This coin is a silver coin that was minted almost 2,000 years ago in Jerusalem by Jews. And this, I hasten to add, it's not a real one, it's a replica of that coin, unfortunately. But that's what they want. They want to pull out of there. And of course, getting Israel to pull out of the West Bank, no matter what pressure is applied by the international community, is not going to happen, because Israel knows very well that if they withdraw their security forces from the West Bank, they've seen the consequences of pulling out of Gaza, they've seen the consequences of pulling back from southern Lebanon, they've seen the consequences of pulling out of Sinai. I'm not saying they shouldn't have done those things, but they've seen the consequences of it. And to pull out of the West Bank and allow an Islamic state, and I don't mean an Islamic state as a Palestinian state, but an Islamic state, a terrorist state, which it would become, undoubtedly would become, would be a fatal error for Israel.
Okay, Tal, a lot in Richard what he said, but let's start with one point. I mean, surely part of the problem with the resolution, or the issue with the resolution, is I know you're saying it's going to force Israel to choose, but Richard's right, isn't it? The resolution essentially says that lands of the Bible, lands from 2,000 years ago, coins minted in Jerusalem, those places are now considered settlements. Is that your reading of this, your view?
Well, my view is that the American view hasn't changed, from previous administrations. And actually, the Obama administration has been the least hostile to the Israeli government. I mean, if you look at the amount of resolution passed by, with support of the Nixon administration and both George Bush presidents and Ronald Reagan, you get to some double-digit resolution passed by the UN. So I don't see anything different from the American point of view. What Israel really lost with this resolution is a lot of the consensus that it had along the major settlement blocks, because there was no argument around this, because these are in any future peace agreements will be protected. If you look at the Clinton parameters from 2000, they would be protected. The main issue is from the continuous construction of illegal outposts and the retroactive acts of trying to legalize it under the law. That's the main issue.
Well, you say it's the main issue.
About Jerusalem, the American view hasn't changed. America respects, and John Kerry mentioned it in his speech, that America respects Israel rights in Jerusalem, is historic and Jewish rights in Jerusalem.
The resolution does expressly state
Israel's legal hold of Western Jerusalem, which never happened before, I think. So I think there are quite a lot of positive things in the resolution. I know it's probably much easier to look at the more negative sides, but I think there are quite a lot of positives, and we also need to consider those.
Okay, but if we look, well, one of the positives clearly from what you're saying is that Israel will now make a choice, in your view, between a one-state solution and a two-state solution. But isn't Richard, what he said is essentially correct, that if there is an Israeli withdrawal right now from the West Bank, it would be replaced by a Palestinian state that would quickly become subsumed by radical Islam. Isn't that the case?
Yes, obviously that can happen, and that's why you don't need to unilaterally withdraw, as happened in Gaza and South Lebanon, because you leave the vacuum, and Richard is a military expert. He knows when you leave a vacuum, terrorist group going to enter this vacuum. That's why it needs to be a direct negotiation between Israel and the Palestinians with some land swaps. And that's why any expansion of settlements right now in any of these illegal outposts is not really helpful for peace, because it puts facts on the ground. Even the Israeli diplomats will admit that it's really difficult for them to defend the Israeli government position, because it makes the two-state solution quite impossible on the ground when we build more and more and more of those settlements outside the major blocks. That's the reality on the ground, and that's the purpose of it. It makes it difficult to achieve and to fulfill the two-state solution. And that's fine. If that's the policy of the government, they should just come clean and say that's what we pursue, that's what we support. We would like to give the Palestinians, all the millions of Palestinians that live in the West Bank, full rights, and to have binational states. But they need to come clean about it, and not to claim that they pursue the two-state solution while in reality, on the ground, things are quite different.
Well, Richard, Tal says it's possible to have direct negotiations and then a normal Palestinian state to emerge. He, in fact, cited you as a military man who would agree with that. Do you agree with that?
Well, no, because, of course, you can't have a sovereign, independent state with a foreign state's armed forces on it. And that's what would have to happen. And the Palestinians are never going to agree to that. The reality, of course, is that the Palestinians don't want a two-state solution. They want a one-state solution. That state is not to be a Jew. They want to control the whole of the area. That's what they've always wanted. And those people who pretend that settlements are the cause of conflict or are the major stumbling block in the peace process, I'm afraid of deceiving themselves, because we saw violence, Arab violence in the 19th century. We saw it in the 20th century, before the Balfour Declaration, before the foundation of the State of Israel. We've seen constant hostility over 2 centuries to Jewish presence. That's not going to change just because there are no settlements or because settlement building ceases. The reality is that both the Israeli side and the Palestinian side agreed in 1995 and in the Oslo Accords that the decision on settlements would be left for the final solution, for the final resolution of the dispute between the two sides. And what we're asking for, let's think what the United Nations is asking for and what Britain's asking for. I say Britain particularly because it makes me feel very guilty that my government's asking for this. We're asking for a territory to be Judenrein, to be free, to be cleansed of Jews. They don't want Jews there. It's the only part of the world, really, that obviously other Arab states have the same policies, but it's the only part of the world where we are insisting that there should be no Jews. There's only one period of time in the whole of history when Jews were forbidden from living in private land, not owned by other people, or in public land in that part of the world. And that was when the Jordanians occupied that territory from 1948 to 1967. It was made a capital offence, an offence that the Palestinian authorities maintain, to sell land to Jews. Now, we want that to come back into being again. It's immoral, it's wrong, and in my view, it's illegal. And the settlements, whatever anyone says, and I have deep respect for Tal Ofer, but whatever anybody says, they are not illegal, and nobody's proven to be illegal so far. There are different views. It is disputed territory, which has got to be resolved by bilateral negotiations between the Israelis and the Palestinian Authority.
I mean, Tal, that's true, isn't it? At the end of the day, the settlements are a red herring in the actual ultimate peace negotiations. You can say they might alter the mood music slightly, but no one's, if you got rid of the settlements tomorrow, we'd be no closer to peace than we are today. Isn't that correct?
Well, the settlements are not the only reason why there is no peace agreements. That's for sure. And I think that the resolution is clear that it's not the only issue that blocks peace agreement at the moment. But I think I agree with Richard on one thing, and I think we both share the same view that Israel will protect and will hold the main settlement blocks in any event of peace agreement. I think what we probably disagree on is those settlements outside the major blocks, and that's what the international community is so much against it, because Israel had the backing from its international allies for the major settlement blocks. It is those ones which are outside the blocks which are causing the controversy, and that's why if they cease construction in those areas, it can at least give hope. It can be a building measure for potentially restarting and resuming the negotiations with the Palestinians. But as long as you keep putting those facts on the ground, as I said before, it makes it really, really difficult and hard to achieve it.
Well, Richard, where do we go from here?
Well, I think the only service the international community can do to this situation is to apply pressure, not to Israel, because Israel has shown willingness to negotiate. Israel and the Prime Minister of Israel, even very recently, has said he extends the offer to the President of the Palestinian Authority to come and talk peace with him, which has been ignored. Israel has made probably the best offer that can realistically be made for for a two-state solution on a number of occasions, and on each occasion they have been rejected by the Palestinians. So it's not Israel that requires the pressure placed upon it. I'm not saying Israel's perfect, because it isn't. Of course it isn't. Like Britain isn't perfect. concessions. They froze settlement buildings during the last phase of negotiations, and that was ignored by the Palestinians. They still refuse to negotiate effectively. And so the pressure is not to be applied to Israel. The pressure should be applied to the Palestinian Authority, rather than us pouring money into the Palestinian Authority in order to maintain their intransigence and in order to support those people who carry out acts of violence against Jews in Israel. We should be withholding funds from them. We should be making life difficult for them, particularly their leaders. We should certainly not be offering them carrots. We should be stick until they actually show that they actually do have some intention of negotiating. Now, how can you possibly show that you're expecting and intending and wanting to make peace with your neighbours if all of your educational textbooks, your television broadcasts, your speeches, your funding goes in to vilifying and instilling hatred into your people of those people that you want to make peace with? It just doesn't add up, and I'm afraid that we might want the Palestinians to be perfect. We might think that they're people who deserve their own state, but actually, as things stand at present, that I'm not convinced of that. I'm not convinced they're ready, and I'm not convinced they want it either. I think they really do want conflict, and I think they really do want just one state, a state dominated by them. The other question is, we must pressure them, but I think in reality, we can't expect anything else other than something like the status quo, perhaps the status quo with an improved economy, hopefully for the Palestinians, an improved sovereignty or improved self-governance over their own areas. But the status quo as it is today, I see no prospect while the Palestinians maintain their intransigence of any kind of a two-state solution.
A quick final thought from you, Tal. Richard's painted quite a bleak picture of the future, but he's not wrong, is he? The real problem is the Palestinians won't really negotiate in good faith. Every time they come to the table, they leave the table. Every time and more concessions given, they leave the table. Isn't it really time we actually the international community inverted the pressure it was placing, and rather than pressuring Israel to get to the table, which it has shown itself willing to do, isn't it time for the Palestinians to be pressured to get back to that table?
Absolutely, the international community has to pressure Palestinians, and obviously the resolution wasn't as balanced as it should have been towards the Palestinians. And I agree with Richard about the incitement, and I think that our government here stopped funding recently to the Palestinian Authority because of those very same issues that Richard mentioned. I think as the time goes by, the prospect for a two-state solution diminish and disappear. And that's why it's really, really important, and that's what the resolution is about, is try to give it maybe one last chance before the reality on the ground changes, because we hear voices within the Israeli government from Naftali Bennett, the leader of the Jewish Home, who is calling to annex some of these areas and to go towards the one-state solution. And we know that Prime Minister Netanyahu is embroiled in several investigations now, and it doesn't really look good at the moment. So we need willingness on both sides, and if the international community can pressure the Palestinians back to the negotiating table and be a bit more balanced, then I think it will be good for both sides. And I think we all in the end want to achieve peace. And I think that recently the poll in Israel showed that more than 60% last week showed that they are supporting the two-state solution. So I think we still have to be optimistic and still hopeful that we can get back to the negotiating table to get the two sides and to hopefully negotiate an agreement.
Great. Gentlemen, thank you. That's all we've got time for. Thank you both for joining us, and thank you for joining us at home. We'll see you again soon for another episode of Current Affairs on JTV.